Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on my podcast all about surviving narcissistic abuse. Today, we are diving into a topic that I know is going to resonate deeply with so many of you because it's one that is incredibly common, incredibly damaging, and yet very often misunderstood. And that is the behaviors of the female narcissist. Now, before we get into this, I want to make something very, very clear. Narcissism is not limited to one gender, but the way it presents in women can often look very different. It tends to be more covert, more psychological, more relational. And because of that, it can take people a very long time to recognize what they're actually dealing with. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because female narcissists are often able to hide behind roles that society naturally trusts. The nurturing mother, the supportive partner, the woman who's been through so much, the one who appears kind, generous, or even self-sacrificing. And when someone is operating from that image, it becomes incredibly difficult to reconcile the behavior with the role. So instead of questioning her, people question themselves. They minimize what's happening. They rationalize it. They make excuses for it. And over time, that confusion becomes part of the control. So today, we are not just going to list a few traits. We are going to walk through a much deeper breakdown of the behaviors that tend to show up with female narcissists, and more importantly, what those behaviors do to you over time. Because the real damage is not just in what they do, it's in what it slowly conditions you to believe about yourself, your reality, and your worth. And once you see these patterns for what they are, you realize this wasn't accidental. There was a system driving it. So now let's just dive right into the specific behaviors that you will usually see exhibited by a female narcissist. One of the most defining behaviors of these women is her extreme sensitivity to criticism. And I'm not just talking about harsh criticism. I'm talking about even the most gentle, constructive, well-intended feedback. Dealing with a woman like this is like walking through a field of landmines. You never quite know what's going to set her off. And when it does, the reaction feels completely disproportionate. What might have been a normal conversation with a healthy person turns into defensiveness, rage, or even emotional retaliation. And the reason for that is because criticism doesn't just feel uncomfortable to a narcissist. It feels like a direct threat to the false identity that they've built. That image of being perfect, superior, admired, it has to be protected at all costs. So instead of taking in feedback, reflecting, or adjusting, she rejects it completely and often punishes the person who delivered it. And what that teaches you over time is very clear. Don't ever be honest. Don't ever challenge, and don't ever speak up. And slowly but surely, you will eventually find that you're silencing yourself just to keep the peace. Another major behavior of the female narcissist is an obsession with her appearance and image. For the majority of these women, appearance is everything. And I don't just mean how she looks physically, although that is often a big part of it. I mean the entire image she projects to the outside world. Who she's seen with, where she goes, what she owns, how she's perceived by others. It's like her entire life is a performance and everything has to fit that script at all times. There is a constant awareness of how things look, not how they actually are. And because of that, there is very little interest in anything that exists beneath the surface. Depth, authenticity, character, emotional connection, those things, the things that actually matter in real relationships, take a back seat to maintaining that image. Conversations stay surface level. Relationships start to feel transactional, like people are being used to support the role she's trying to play rather than being genuinely connected. And if and when something authentic or vulnerable does come through, it rarely stays that way. It gets managed, filtered, or redirected to protect the illusion she's trying so hard to maintain. And over time, that creates a dynamic that feels incredibly hollow. Because even though everything may look perfect from the outside, on the inside, it feels disconnected, performative, and ultimately very, very empty. Another behavior that shows up very strongly in these women is extreme competitiveness. I cannot stress this one enough. Female narcissists are often driven by a deep, almost obsessive need to be the best, the most attractive, the most successful, the most admired in every room they walk into. And this doesn't just show up in obvious places like work or social settings. It shows up everywhere, with friends, with family, and very often, unfortunately, even with their own children. There is no safe space where you are just allowed to be. You are always, whether you realize it or not, part of some silent competition that only she is keeping score of. And unfortunately, that's not even the worst part of it. Because underneath that competitiveness is something much darker. It's envy, pathological envy. They have a very deep, often subconscious, internal sense of inferiority that they are constantly trying to outrun. And instead of dealing with that internally, they project it outward. So instead of celebrating other people, they compare, they compete, they judge, they criticize, and they diminish. They look for ways to bring others down just enough to restore their sense of superiority. And if someone around them shines in a way that threatens their image or perceived status, that becomes a very, very big problem. You may notice subtle put-downs, dismissiveness, or even a complete shift in their demeanor towards that person. What once felt like support can quickly turn into tension or quiet hostility. And over time, this creates a very uncomfortable environment where you feel like you can't fully be yourself. You start dimming your light, second-guessing your successes, or holding back parts of who you are just to avoid triggering something in them. And that's how their internal insecurity slowly starts shaping your behavior without you even realizing it. Another behavior that's incredibly damaging is the use of manipulative punishments. When a female narcissist is unhappy with you, she often doesn't address it directly. There's no real conversation, no attempt at understanding, and certainly no interest in resolution. Instead, she punishes you. And it's important to understand that this isn't about working through an issue. It's about teaching you a lesson and putting you back in your place. It's about conditioning your behavior so that next time you think twice before doing or saying anything that might displease her. And those punishments can take many different forms. It might be the silent treatment, where you're suddenly cut off emotionally and left wondering what you did wrong. It can be emotional withdrawal, where the warmth and the connection that once existed just disappears. It may be withholding affection, attention, or even basic communication. In some cases, it may even escalate to complete neglect, where you feel like you've been erased altogether. And what makes it even more confusing is that sometimes these reactions are based on something that didn't even happen the way that she perceives it. But unfortunately, facts don't matter to her. Control does. And this is where the real impact starts to take hold, because these punishments tap directly into your emotional needs, especially if you're someone who values closeness, connection, and communication in relationships. So when that gets taken away, it creates anxiety. It creates a sense of urgency. You feel this internal pressure to fix it, to make things right, to restore the connection as quickly as possible. And before you even realize what's happening, you're the one taking responsibility. You're the one trying to repair a situation that you didn't create, just to get back some sense of normalcy. And over time, this becomes a pattern. You start adjusting your behavior to avoid those punishments. You become more and more cautious, more agreeable, more willing to suppress your own needs just to keep the peace. And that's how control is established. Not through direct force, but through repeated emotional conditioning that slowly teaches you to abandon yourself in order to maintain the relationship. Another behavior that often stands out is the use of sexuality as a form of manipulation. Female narcissists are very aware of the power of their appearance and their sexuality, and they are not afraid to use it to get what they want. That can show up in a lot of different ways. Provocative behavior, excessive or inappropriate flirting, or even crossing serious lines by engaging in relationships within their own social circle. And many times it's not subtle either. It's deliberate. It's calculated. It's designed to get attention, to provoke reactions, and to keep themselves at the center of everything. And it's important to understand this isn't about genuine connection or attraction. It's not about intimacy in the ways a healthy person would experience it. It's about attention, validation, and control. It's about securing narcissistic supply in whatever way is most effective in that moment. And because of that, there are often very few, if any, real boundaries. Loyalty becomes flexible. Ethics become negotiable. And the impact of their behavior on the other person or people is rarely taken into consideration. And for the people on the receiving end of this, it can feel incredibly confusing and destabilizing, especially if you're someone who values trust and commitment in your relationships. You may find yourself constantly questioning what's real, what's appropriate, and where you stand. And when those boundaries are repeatedly crossed without any real accountability, it creates a sense of emotional instability. You start feeling like the ground is constantly shifting underneath you because the rules of the relationship are never clear and they are always subject to change depending on what serves her in that moment. And over time, this can deeply affect your sense of security, your self-worth, and your ability to trust not just her, but yourself. Because when someone repeatedly violates boundaries and then minimizes it or denies it completely, you start second-guessing your own instincts. And that is exactly how this behavior becomes so damaging. Another major issue with the female narcissist is a complete disregard for boundaries. These women do not see boundaries the way healthy people do. To them, boundaries are not something to respect. They're something to override. Your space, your privacy, your time, your belongings, none of it is truly off limits. It's like there is this underlying belief that they are entitled to have access to you and everything connected to you whenever they want, without question. And when you try and set boundaries, you're often met with complete dismissal, denial, or even more manipulation. It's like the concept itself doesn't even register, or even worse, it's seen as a personal attack. You may try to communicate clearly, calmly and respectfully, and it either gets ignored, twisted, or turned back on you. Suddenly, you're the one being accused of being difficult, selfish, or unreasonable simply for trying to protect your own space or well-being. And over time, this starts to wear you down because you realize that setting a boundary doesn't actually resolve the problem. It creates a new one. It leads to conflict, pushback, or some form of emotional consequence. So what do you start doing? You start choosing your battles. You start letting things go that shouldn't. You start minimizing your own needs just to avoid the fallout. And that's where the real damage happens. Because little by little, you begin to feel like you don't even have the right to have boundaries. Like asserting yourself is somehow wrong or not worth the trouble. And that's how people lose their sense of autonomy in these relationships. Not all at once, but gradually through repeated experiences where their needs are being dismissed, overridden, or punished. And before they realize it, they are no longer operating from a place of self-respect. They are operating from a place of adaptation. Another behavior that runs very deep in these women is jealousy and pathological envy. Despite the confident image they project, female narcissists are incredibly envious of others. And this isn't just occasional jealousy. It's chronic, it's pervasive, and many times it's operating just beneath the surface, even when they appear completely composed on the outside. And again, instead of addressing that internally, instead of acknowledging those feelings and working through them in a healthy way, they project it outward. So they gossip, they criticize, they pick people apart, often behind their backs, while maintaining a completely different demeanor to their face. And what's interesting is that because they are so driven by envy themselves, they tend to assume that everyone else must be operating the same way. So they convince themselves that other people are jealous of them. And that belief becomes a form of psychological protection. It allows them to maintain their sense of superiority without having to confront the very real feelings of inferiority that are driving the envy in the first place. And this creates a very toxic dynamic where relationships are not built on trust or genuine connection, but on comparison, competition, and quiet resentment. Nothing feels safe or secure because there is always this underlying current of evaluation. Who's better? Who's more attractive? Who's more successful? Who's getting more attention? Who has more money? And if you're close to someone like this, you may find yourself constantly being talked about, evaluated, or even subtly undermined behind your back. They are often two-faced, so what is said to you does not match what is being said about you. And over time, this can make you feel very unsettled. You may start questioning who you can trust, what is being said about you when you're not around, or whether the connection you thought you had was ever genuine to begin with. And that is one of the most damaging aspects of this kind of envy. It doesn't just affect how they see others, it erodes the foundation of trust in every relationship that they touch. Another very common behavior is extreme materialism. Female narcissists often place a very high value on money, possessions, and status symbols. Not because those things bring them any real sense of fulfillment or meaning, but because they reinforce the image they're trying to project to the outside world. The clothes, the cars, the handbags, the lifestyle, it all becomes part of the identity they're trying to sell. It's not just about having nice things. It's about being seen having those things and what those things supposedly say about them. And what's important to understand is that this is not about simply enjoying quality or beauty in life. There's nothing wrong with appreciating nice things. The difference here is in the intention behind it. For the female narcissist, these material items become a form of validation. They become evidence in her mind that she is valuable, she is superior, that she is worthy of admiration. It's like these external objects are being used to fill an internal void that never quite goes away. And because of that, there is often a constant need for more expensive, more impressive, more attention grabbing. It's never really enough because the feeling they're chasing isn't coming from the object itself. It's coming from the reaction they get from other people. And that creates a cycle that never ends. And unfortunately, if she is not smart enough or educated enough to earn her own money to buy herself the things that she wants, and most times she will not be, I can assure you that she has no problem trying to steal your money, steal your assets and your belongings. And for the people around them, this creates a very hollow, exploitative, transactional dynamic. You eventually realize it has nothing to do with who you are. It's all about what you have and how you look and how well you fit into the image they're trying to create, maintain, or steal from you. Another behavior that almost always shows up is a love of drama. Female narcissists thrive in chaos. And if there isn't enough drama for their liking, they will create it, manufacture it themselves. So they will exaggerate situations. They retell stories in a way that makes everything more intense, more emotional, and far more extreme than it actually was. Small, everyday situations somehow turn into full-blown productions. There is always something going on, always some issue, always some crisis that needs immediate attention. And what's really important to understand is that it isn't accidental. Drama serves a purpose. It keeps the attention on them. It keeps people emotionally engaged. It creates stimulation in an otherwise empty internal world. Because without that chaos, things feel flat to them. They bore easily, and drama becomes a way to fill that void and keep things feeling exciting and alive. But for the people around them, this becomes incredibly draining because you are constantly being pulled into situations that don't feel grounded in reality. Everything is heightened. Everything feels urgent. Everything is emotionally charged. You're always reacting, always trying to keep up, always trying to make sense of something that doesn't quite add up. And over time, that kind of environment wears you down in ways that are very hard to explain unless you've actually lived through it. And what often happens is that your nervous system starts to adapt to that level of chaos. You become used to that intensity, even though it's exhausting. And when things are calm, it can almost feel unfamiliar and strange. And that's one of the more subtle ways this kind of dynamic affects you. It doesn't just exhaust you, it reshapes what feels normal. Another behavior is triangulation, or pitting people against each other. Female narcissists are incredibly skilled at creating conflict between others while remaining right in the center of it. They share selective information. They twist details just enough to change the meaning. They play both sides, and then they sit back and watch the fallout as if they had nothing to do with it. And many times it's done in such a subtle and calculated way that the people involved don't immediately catch on. They might tell one person something slightly negative about another, knowing it's going to provoke a reaction. Then they go to the other person and say something just as inflammatory, but from a different angle. And before you know it, there's tension, there's confusion, there's conflict, and she's right in the middle of it, appearing concerned, involved, or even helpful. It's incredibly manipulative because she's creating the problem while simultaneously positioning herself as part of the solution. And what makes this so damaging is that it slowly destroys trust between people. Relationships that once felt safe and stable start to feel uncertain. You begin questioning what's being said, who said what, and who you can actually trust. It creates confusion, resentment, and division, and over time it can completely fracture or even end the relationship completely when there was nothing wrong with the relationship to begin with. Close family relationships are destroyed by these women all the time based on complete lies and their sadistic manipulations. And the most unsettling part is that often the people involved don't realize what's happening until the damage has already been done. By the time the truth comes out, if it ever does come out, the trust has already been broken and the dynamic has already been manipulated beyond recognition. And that's exactly how triangulation works. It operates quietly in the background, creating chaos and disconnection, while the person orchestrating it remains just out of reach of accountability. Another behavior that is extremely common and honestly beyond ridiculous and completely absurd is the victim mentality. No matter what happens, no matter what role she actually played in the situation, the narrative always somehow circles back to how she has been wronged. There is always a story, always an explanation, always a version of events where she ends up being the one who is mistreated, misunderstood, or taken advantage of. And this is one of the most powerful manipulation tactics because it immediately draws people in. It triggers empathy. It makes people feel sorry for her. It makes them want to help, to support, to defend her. Most healthy people are wired to respond to someone who appears to be hurting. And the female narcissist knows that. She knows exactly how to present herself in a way that activates that response in others. But over time, if you're paying attention, you start to notice a pattern. Accountability is never a part of the equation. There is never a moment of genuine self-reflection. There is always someone else to blame, always a justification, always a reason why her behavior makes sense and someone else's doesn't. And that's when things start to shift for you because you realize this isn't occasional, it's constant. And eventually, if you're close to her, you will find yourself cast in that role. You become the person who hurt her, even when all you did was set a boundary or express a concern or stand up for yourself. And suddenly, you're no longer having a conversation. You're defending yourself against a narrative that has already been decided. And that's what makes this so destabilizing. It's not just the behavior, it's the way reality itself gets rewritten, and you're expected to go along with it. And if you don't, you will be on the receiving end of her wrath, because telling the actual truth or expressing the fact that her version of reality is delusional usually means war. She will now attempt, and many times she will succeed at completely destroying your reputation and your life. Mark my words on that one. I know because I lived it. Another behavior is passive-aggressive communication. So instead of direct conversation, everything is indirect. it's tone, it's sarcasm, it's subtle digs, it's withdrawal. It's the shift in energy that you can feel but can't quite point to. And it creates this constant underlying tension because you know something is wrong, but it's never clearly stated. Nothing is ever brought out into the open where it can actually be addressed and resolved. So what ends up happening is you start trying to read between the lines. You replay conversations in your head. You analyze what was said and how it was said, what it might have meant by it. You start scanning for clues, trying to figure out what you did wrong or what needs to be fixed. And all of that mental effort keeps you stuck in a loop because you're trying to solve a problem that isn't being openly acknowledged. And what makes this so effective is that it allows her to maintain control without ever being directly accountable. If you call it out, you're overreacting. If you question it, you're too sensitive. There is always a way to deny, deflect, or minimize what's happening. And over time, that lack of clarity starts to wear you down. It makes you second guess your own perception, and it keeps you in a state of constant uncertainty. And that mental and emotional effort is exhausting. Because instead of having a clear and direct communication where things can actually be worked through, you're left navigating something that feels intentionally unclear. And that's what keeps you engaged, trying to figure it out, trying to get it right, and slowly losing trust in your own ability to interpret what's actually happening. Another behavior is emotional unpredictability. You never quite know what version of her you're going to get. One moment she's warm, engaging, and everything feels easy and connected. And the next, she's cold, distant, or critical, like a switch has been flipped for no apparent reason. And that inconsistency is not just confusing, it's very psychologically destabilizing because there's no clear cause and effect, no consistent pattern that you can rely on. And what that does over time is it pulls you into this very powerful psychological loop where you are constantly trying to figure out how to get back to the good version. You start replaying interactions in your mind, wondering what you did differently, what you said, what you could have done better. You begin trying to manage the environment, your tone, your behavior, just to keep things stable. And slowly, without even realizing it, that becomes your focus. Not whether the relationship is healthy, not whether your needs are being met, but how to maintain some sense of emotional consistency within it. You start orientating yourself around her moods instead of your own reality. And that's where the shift happens, where you stop asking, is this good for me? And start asking, how do I keep this from going bad? And over time, that takes a toll because you're living in a state of constant anticipation, always scanning for the next shift, always trying to stay one step ahead of something that ultimately isn't predictable. And that kind of emotional instability wears you down in a very quiet but very powerful way until it starts to feel normal, even though it's anything but. Another behavior is a complete lack of accountability. No matter what happens, there is always an excuse, always a justification, always someone else to blame. It doesn't matter how clear the situation is or how obvious the behavior may be. There is always a way for her to rewrite it so that she is not responsible. And because of that, real resolution becomes impossible. Because you cannot fix a problem that the other person refuses to acknowledge in the first place. And what makes this so frustrating is that it keeps you stuck in the same cycle over and over and over. Issues never actually get resolved. They just get recycled. The conversation might happen. There may even be a temporary calm, but nothing truly changes because the root of the problem is never owned. And over time, that becomes exhausting because you start to realize you are having the same conversation in different ways over and over again with no real progress. And often what happens is the focus gets shifted back onto you. Somehow the conversation turns into what you did wrong, how you reacted, or why you're the one creating the problem. And now, instead of addressing the original issue, you're defending yourself, explaining yourself, or trying to prove your intentions. And that shift is intentional because it keeps the attention off of her behavior and puts it back onto you. And over time, this can really start to affect your sense of reality. You may begin questioning your own perspective, wondering if you're expecting too much or if you're the one who needs to change. And that's how this dynamic becomes so damaging. Not just because there's no accountability, but because it slowly conditions you to stop expecting it. Another behavior is subtle, ongoing criticism. It may not be obvious at first, but it's consistent. Small comments, little digs, things said under the guise of jokes, advice, or just being honest. And because it's not always direct or aggressive, it can be easy to overlook in the beginning. You might even question whether you're reading too much into it. But over time, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And what makes this so damaging is that it's not one big moment. It's a slow, steady erosion. It's the repeated suggestions that you're not quite doing enough, not quite getting it right, not quite measuring up. And even if each individual comment seems minor, the accumulation of them starts to have an effect. They linger. They plant seeds of doubt. And the longer that goes on, the more it begins to shape how you see yourself. You start second guessing your decisions. You become more self-conscious. You may even find yourself anticipating criticisms before it's spoken, adjusting your behavior to avoid it. And that's how it works. It gradually shifts your internal sense of confidence into something much more fragile and dependent on external approval. And over time, you may not even recognize the version of yourself that has adopted to this, because what started as a few offhanded comments has slowly turned into an internal voice that echoes those same criticisms. And that's when it becomes especially damaging, when the external criticisms have been internalized and you begin doing the work for them without even realizing it. And the final outcome of all of this for anyone who has a person like this in their life is ultimately identity erosion. Over time, you begin to lose your sense of self. You become less certain, less confident, less connected to who you are at your core. The things that once felt clear to you, your values, your instincts, your sense of right and wrong, start to feel blurred. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually through all of these repeated experiences where your reality is questioned, your boundaries are pushed, ignored and ridiculed, and your sense of self is slowly overridden. And that is where the deepest damage happens. Not just in what was said or done to you, but in what it slowly turns you into, because you start adapting in ways you never thought you would. You become more cautious, more self-doubting, more focused on maintaining the relationship than staying connected to yourself. I cannot stress enough how damaging it is to be exposed to narcissistic abuse over a long period of time. Damaging to your identity, damaging to your sanity, damaging to your beliefs and perceptions, damaging to your relationships with loved ones, damaging to your physical and mental health and well-being, and the list goes on and on and on. So in closing, if you recognize these patterns, I want you to understand something very clearly. This is not about you being too sensitive or too emotional. This is about patterns of manipulation that are designed to create confusion, self-doubt, and dependency over time. And once you begin to see those patterns clearly, something starts to change because you cannot unsee it. And once you stop questioning your own reality, you can begin to step out of the dynamic that's been keeping you stuck. That's really where healing begins. Not by trying to fix them or make sense of their behavior, but by reconnecting with yourself, your instincts, your clarity, and your sense of truth. And if this episode resonated with you and you're trying to make sense of your situation, I do work with clients privately, and I also have resources available to help you go deeper in your healing. You can find information on my private coaching, recovery course, and private community on my website at jillwise.com, linked in the description below.